you a little bit more about myself and the work I do, and of course talk about the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 20 years later on. So let me see if I can make my screen appear. Is it coming yet? Sorry, my computer is a little bit slow right now. I think it's been working too hard all day. Okay, let me see. And one more click.
Super, we can see it now.
Okay, can you see it? Okay, good. All right, I didn't know what photo to pick, but at least you can see me for one moment. So as Annika was saying, I have been all over the place. Most recently, I have been in the US for something like 19 years, almost. And I have arrived in Sweden here at the Defense University a little over, well, officially a little over a year ago, but then moved with my family here only last summer. So I'm still learning Swedish, but I was kind of able to follow along with the introduction, and I'm starting to learn a little bit. So you might notice that I titled the talk UN Security Council Resolution 1325 at 20, a few provocations. And the first thing I want to say, which Annika already hinted at, is that one of the problems I think we have is with calling it the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, because as many activists and scholars have said from the very beginning, we have a tension in the agenda, which concerns that three things that I want to talk to you about. And one of the important ones here is that while we are actually trying to talk about gender and how gender shapes questions of security, we keep coming back to women, and we keep coming back to whatever notion people have in their heads about what that means when we talk about women. So from the outset, I think there are three tensions in the agenda that we continue to see over so many years now. So one is that we want to focus on people and grassroots, but we are doing so, of course, through the mechanism of the UN and the UN Security Council. So through the state-centric organization. And that has implications for how the agenda has developed over the years, particularly with the focus on national action plans. So again, a state-centric focus, which, as scholars in my field have pointed out, has led to this way in which some states have developed what we call outward-facing national action plans, where the states basically use it to guide their foreign policies. And this is something that Sweden has done as well, though Sweden has also some other things. We'll talk about that later. And then some states, particularly in the global south, or states where the Women, Peace and Security agenda was implemented later, have this inward focus. So the NAPs, the national action plans for those states, very much look at changing the internal politics. And along with that, we also see that sometimes in the states, the responsibility for who is in charge is located in foreign ministries. And so that's often an indication that we're dealing with an outward-looking program, or it's in women's ministries, which might not have a whole lot of power. We're often dealing with an internal plan. So there's a whole story here about how the fact that this agenda has been located at a state-centric institution shapes the way it's been proliferating. But there's also another story, which is that the story of various organizations and around the world who are taking this on for their own good, and the story of how it came to be in the beginning. But you're probably quite familiar with that, but we can definitely talk about it. But we still see this tension of the initial goals of the activists who brought it to the UN, and the way in which scholars also would like to engage it, and then the organization that has taken it on and how that shapes how it is implemented. The other thing that is a tension from the beginning and that we still see is that we are really concerned with gender, peace and security, which is also in my title, of course, but we are at the same time in many ways focusing on women. So we are focusing on women as victims in wars, we are focusing on women as activists in peace processes. So we have this constant tension where gender, both in reality, in that we actually do need to focus on the impacts, for example, of war and violence on women, in terms of peace processes, actually leads us back to women. But what we sometimes forget in the process is the role of men. This has gotten a lot more attention, but I think one of the problems has been that we continue to talk about women, peace, and security. And so linguistically, it brings us back to equating gender with women. Sorry, this way. And then, again, this is probably also familiar to those of you working with this, is that we have at the same time this need to center the protection of the vulnerable, but then also demanding a recognition of women's expertise and women's participation. So the protection participation tension that we continue to see. And these are tensions, I think, that we can't really ever get rid of. The question is, how do we, in our work, deal with those tensions? How do we keep them front and center and constantly question what we do in response to them whenever we are asked to comment on something? And so I have sort of three broad thoughts on this that I would love to discuss with you when we get to the Q&A, because I always find it very interesting to learn from people who are actually doing a lot of the activist work on the ground. So I think one really important way that has been pointed out also by lots of feminist scholars in the literature, there is, of course, right now an explosion of the literature since we are nearing, or we are in the sort of 20th anniversary year. I've been involved with a journal called the International Feminist Journal of Politics, which has two special issues on the 20th anniversary forthcoming later this year, and there's lots of other activism coming out. So one of the things that would be interesting to do maybe later, at a later point, is to also share that information, translate the academic work specifically for activists, or make sure that it gets out there. But when we talk about the work that's been coming out, insisting that we think about gender and not just women, and that we do so intersectionally, has been really important. This comes out, for example, around the issue of sexual violence. So a lot of scholars have been working on sexual violence also against men, and how that challenges our assumptions around who perpetrates violence, who needs protection, how we protect people who have been affected, what kind of support they need, but also looking at people who don't conform to either the male or female stereotypes. So what happens when we're talking about queer or trans people? This is a huge issue because, of course, they might be targeted specifically because of their gender identity. And if we keep to just, women, peace, and security, they sometimes fall out. When we're talking about intersectionality in the sort of feminist scholarly community, we're talking about the ways in which not all women are equally vulnerable or equally able to participate. And this might have a lot to do with where in the world they are based, which class they belong to, intersections with their sexuality or their race. And all of these things are forcing in a good way, are challenging, I would say, feminist scholars to think more deeply about what it means to think about gender, peace, and security. And one of the things that I've been involved with, which has been really exciting, is a sort of revisioning of feminist peace research, going back to a long history of work and remembering some of the things that we have already done that sometimes get forgotten. But doing it intersectionality and recognizing that, for example, if Sweden, as part of its feminist foreign policy, is producing guidelines for what to do in other parts of the world, that we really take into account how societies are quite different, how women are located differently within them, how sometimes, you know, things we take for granted aren't taken for granted elsewhere, and so forth. So really being very specific and constantly asking people to not just talk about women in general, but to be specific about which women and where. And then one of the other things that comes up again and again in the literature is that there continues to be a tendency to think of the world in terms of a global north and a global south, and where often the global north is supposedly the place that has a lot of the knowledge, and the global south is the recipient.
Excuse me, Annick, for interrupting you, but I can't see you. I can just see some of us participators. So maybe the technical support could have a look into it, or is it just me that I am missing your face and your PowerPoint?
I don't know about how the technical situation can work.
I don't know if Annika or Filippa could look into it so we can see you and your presentation instead of ourselves.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort it out. Is it that you're on a phone, right?
Yes, iPhone.
Okay, wait a second, I will try.
Well, I'll keep quiet now. I just wanted, if it can be helped, it would be good. But if not, it can't be helped. I can hear you at least.
I can share the PowerPoint later also, and then you can send it by email.
Okay, so, thank you.
Yes. So what I was saying was that one of the problems is that we still, unfortunately, often think about a global north that has knowledge that needs to be brought to the global south, even though, of course, feminist activists and scholars from the global south have been long telling us that this is not true. And some colleagues of mine have recently been looking at, done a global study of the national action plans, but also other documents relating to UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the following resolutions, where they find that actually some of the first documents, of course, were not national action plans, which create a very northern-centric view of this agenda, but rather they were from the African continent. So they were various documents coming out of the African continent. And so more and more we are finding that feminist scholars are looking at what is it that the global south can actually teach us about how to work with the agenda. So that's the one thing. The other thing that also comes out of my work with thinking about feminist foreign policy is that by placing it into the foreign policy agenda in many cases, we sometimes miss the ways in which the domestic and the international are connected. And so one of the ways to maybe think more productively is to really try to make linkages across issues. For example, I've been very heartened by the way in which the UN during this crisis has been focusing on paying attention to domestic violence as well. So to connect the sort of domestic and international both in terms of the kinds of experiences women might even have in the domestic in their own home, and the international. What are the kind of ways in which violence, gendered violence, is connecting across the world? So not just in this sort of north-south divide, and not just in the the international where we help others, but actually to maybe look a little bit inward with the agenda as well. And then the last one, which is close to a lot of my own research, is working on how to rethink security. So if we think back to the beginnings of 1325 and the activism that led to it becoming a UN Security Council resolution, which is, I mean, still amazing to me 20 years later that that was possible, and that it sort of gave these issues a huge or a much larger profile. But what also kind of got lost over time, and which I would like to maybe think about with you all as well, is this question of rethinking security. So at the time when the agenda was brought to the Security Council, we also had a conversation about human security, and switching or moving from state-centric security perspective, where it was all about defending the state from an outside attacker, to thinking more broadly about what would it mean to center humans, and to center their needs and to center their rights. And so one of the things that has gotten lost, and which has been worrying to watch, particularly maybe in the last 10 years as well, is the ways in which states have actually used the women, peace and security agenda to argue, for example, for putting more women into the military, or for making war better for women in some strange ways that are counter to a lot of what feminist activists and feminist scholars have long argued. So how do we actually think about security, and related to that also peace, really taking into account long-standing feminist commitments, and really taking into account questions that are also on our minds right now with the COVID crisis, like whose work do we value, whose lives do we value, what would it actually mean to have sort of a feminist perspective on security? And I have some thoughts on this. I've written a book on this, but I would love to hear what you have to think as well. So since we don't have a whole lot of time, I thought I would end it here, and we can talk about questions you have. I can expand on any of these things infinitely. It was actually really hard to boil it down to just a few thoughts. So please feel free also to contact me. My email is on the slide, and if you don't have the slide, I'm sure we can share that some other way. And then maybe I should turn off the slide and show my face. Is that?
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Annick. This was a very good presentation, and it was very thought-provoking. So I'm sure not only I have questions now. I also would like to remind all the participants that Annick's inaugural presentation at her professorship is still online. So there is a lot of resources that we can share. This was just such a little nudge that we feel like learning more from you. So we will make sure that we spread these resources. Before we delve into questions, I would like to inform all the participants that we are recording this session. And if anybody has thoughts about that, just send me an email. So now I am trying to see hands or questions in the chat for the person who would like to start. Charlotte, of course. Now I will see if I can unmute you. Can you speak, Charlotte?
Yes, I think I unmuted
welcome.
myself. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Annick, for a very interesting presentation. So my name is Charlotte, and I work at the office. And I have spent the last few days on thinking about how to develop a new project because we're always applying for new projects. And one thing that has crossed my mind is this, like, what method to use. We always talk, like the whole community working on these issues, always talk about including women in the formal peace processes, like having a seat at the table for the women, or for one woman or several women. But in the policy briefs that I recently got on my email from Georgetown University, they write about the track 2 peace processes, the informal peace processes, where you would support movements, the feminist movements in the countries where you're working instead of supporting individual women. So just your reflections on that, like to change the perspective to support movements rather than individuals. What do you think about that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I would like to take a couple of more questions immediately before we give it over to Annick. So first is Åse Smedler, and then I have Ann Stödberg. Sorry, I will just try to Åse.
I am unmuted, yes. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Annick, for thought-provoking, very intense lesson indeed. The one thing I would like to just dwell or ask you to think, to explain a little bit more, is the tensions that you mentioned between the global south and the global north in the context of gender, peace and security, or women, peace and security. So that was what I wanted to listen from you.
Thank you very much, Åse. And we will have the next question from Ann.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Annika. It was very interesting. And my question is on the issue of security, because we have been discussing a bit about the widening of the term in the sense of human security. Is this something that you have reflected on? Is this a more valid term to talk about human security rather than security? I mean, it gives it another dimension and perhaps is more relevant to what we are actually trying to work on. So that's my question.
Okay, I don't see any more raised hands. So Annick, would you please say some final words to these very big and interesting, important questions?
Okay, wow, these are questions that could each at least take several weeks, but I will try to give you just a few ideas. So one on the formal versus informal, track 1, track 2, and how to include women. There is, from the feminist research that I've seen and read about this, there is good evidence that actually including women's movements is really, really important. So when we have seen successes in women's participation in peace processes, we have found that it had to be women that were really embedded in a larger movement. It's one thing to be at the table, but you need the sort of broader pressure group of being deeply embedded in larger civil society and in these kind of broader movements that can mobilize to support whatever the actual person at the table says. And we haven't seen as much success when we've had sort of women that were sort of handpicked but didn't have those connections to the community, to the peace movement in the country, to the women's movement in the country. The caveat here is that we have very little evidence of women being included in particularly track 1, a little bit more in track 2. So the research that we have is is kind of inconclusive. So we can't really overstate it. The problem with track 2 and the sort of more informal process is that then you are kind of not really at the table. So it's a tension that I could have identified as well, but we weren't really talking about peace processes. What we've tried to talk about more is meaningful participation, like what makes participation meaningful. Is it possible to have participation in such a way that the issues are on the agenda, no matter whether it's a woman or a man who brings them to the agenda? Women might also have other points on the agenda. If women are representing, for example, particular religious groups or political groups, then they might not want to take on women's issues. So it's really quite complicated. But there is some good evidence that the embeddedness in a political movement, in a women's movement, is really, really important for both having enough pressure to get attention to women's issues, but then also for the long term of trying to make the outcomes of the process work. So I don't know if that's satisfying, but that's sort of where we are in the research.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
And then on the global south, global north tensions, I think this is a broader issue that we're seeing in sort of feminist global politics, that we see it particularly in the research. I am not as sure if we see it as much in the activism, because I think the activism is often much more transnational, but we see a lot of complaints about this in the research, that there is this sort of sense that the way in which the global south is talked about is always only as a recipient of information and knowledge, and not as a source of that knowledge and information, and something where we might actually learn something the other way around. And so there has been a lot more effort recently to make sure that when we talk about this, we try to include a wider variety of voices. And of course, there's, this is a huge imbalance in general in global politics in terms of who has the money, who has the connections, who has the big representation at the UN as well. I mean, who gets to sit on the UN Security Council, all of these kind of questions. So one of the issues here is how would we shift that more broadly globally? That's a huge question to think about, and that one that has no easy answers, really. I would like to take maybe a couple more minutes to talk about Anne's question, or about the issue of security, because the whole question of how we think about security is one that I've engaged with for many, many years. I actually started when I did my PhD. That's kind of where I started, because I was fascinated by how we all have a common sense notion of what security is. And it has very little to do with the way that states think about security. So when we think about security, we think about safety, and we think about people, and we think about access to rights and resources and all of those kind of things. But when states think about security, and when the sort of discipline that I'm in, international politics, when we think about security, we also already presume that the state functioned and works for the people within the state. And so the idea is all we need to do is protect the state. But what it leaves out, of course, is that most states don't actually do that. So the idea of shifting to human security, or shifting it from the state being the main entity to protect to actually humans, has really been important for people in my field of research, which propose, of course, to governments where to spend their money, to think about this differently. And I think it very much is what feminists can draw on now. It becomes complicated because the notion of human itself needs to be gendered. So we know this from the women's rights movement, and it's not as simple as to say, oh, if we focus on humans, then we also automatically also focus on gendered beings or race beings, but we actually are still caught in sort of this idea of universal man. So we still need to do more work, even if we go to human security. But what human security, I think, offers is sort of putting that what we normally think of as security when we're just thinking about it as everyday people, and the human and our own like physical survival, our health, which is really important right now, and those kind of questions at the center. So when human security was developed, it originally came out of the UN development program report from 1994, bringing together human development questions and human rights questions and linking them up with security. That was really a way to shift us away from thinking about security of states only and thinking about security of states in terms of the military, and instead thinking about security, economic security, societal security, and those kind of questions. So I do think human security is a much more productive way for feminists to think about security, with all the caveats that then we still have to talk about what does it mean to be human. And it's only been somewhat recently that women were recognized as being human. So I hope that's a mini version of my answers.
Thank you very much. And there are a couple of more questions. I think we'll take the time, if that's okay with Ann Stödberg as well. I would like to give the word first to Gunnel, if you would like to speak. The question has been written in the chat, but maybe you would like to say it, but I need to find you and unmute you. In the meantime, I will read Gunnel's question, which is, it's the wrong focus to increase women in the military. That's the wrong focus of the concept of security. And I think you've touched upon that. Sorry, I don't find Gunnel. Maybe, here. Yes, you're on.
Okay. Yeah, your state were working on the rethink security, and you said more women in the military, but I missed the rest of that meaning. So I would like to know what other ideas you have studied in this question.
Shall we take more, or is it just one?
Sorry?
Do we have more questions?
Yes, we'll have a couple of more questions. So Jante, I have unmuted you, and then Dilara. Jante, please go ahead.
Yes, well, I was wondering whether when we talk about the military, that's they're usually men. It's a sort of a male collective, and we can see it as macho and not having the feminist values that we like to propagate. And when you are in a military context, are they, the people around you, prepared to listen to this kind of reasoning, and are they open to a more feminist perspective? That would be very interesting to know.
Thank you very much. And now it should be Dilara's turn.
Yes, thank you, Annick. For those of you who doesn't know me, my name is Dilara, and I mainly work as a master trainer for the Swedish organization Nonviolent Sweden. I think you just talked at the end, you mentioned the relationship between violence against women and COVID-19. And I would like to just know if you can tell a little bit more about what challenges and work we're facing regarding security and protection when it comes to women and the relationship to COVID-19. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are the questions I think we have time for. So please, Annick, I will ask you for your final words.
Yes. Again, these are really great questions and also really big questions. So I would just say a couple of things and then hopefully you can discuss them yourself. So one, for Gunnel, I did not argue for more women in the military. I said that one of the things that has happened lately is that militaries around the world have taken up the agenda, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, to basically translate it to say, you know, oh, what that means for us is we just need to add more women to the military. So I'm not saying that that's actually what we want to do, but I think one of the interesting questions here might be to look at women in peacekeeping and to look at how it has made a difference to have women in peacekeeping operations or not. And so that's it's a tricky question, but one that I think we need to ask these more complicated questions. So is it a good thing if we have women in the military, if that means they can be part of peacekeeping and then do things in peacekeeping that maybe male soldiers can't do or don't do or are not doing because of their masculine attachments and all of this kind of stuff. So I think when I think about questions we should be asking, I think we need to ask these hard questions that make us somewhat uncomfortable and sort of push us to really specify what it is that we're trying to argue for. And there is some research on that, because of course, once women enter these spaces, it's really hard for them often. And many women who have tried to join militaries often leave them quite quickly, or they are subject to terrible types of violence. I've done some research on the kind of violence that women have experienced in the US military, so that's not great. And that comes to the question that Janse was asking about, do these military folks listen to me? And that's interesting. I actually asked myself before I applied for this position quite a lot of questions. You know, can I possibly work in this kind of environment? Like, what does it mean for a feminist scholar to be in a military affiliated institution? I mean, right now I'm actually mostly teaching civilians, so not military, because we have those programs as well. But of course, I am part of a lot of conversations, and I get asked also to present to the military, and it's they have been quite willing to listen. I am not sure whether they fully understand what I'm saying, so that would be an interesting question to think about a couple of years down the line, like what is actually happening. They are quite interested in some questions that are instrumental for them, and there I have to kind of constantly check in with myself to see whether I'm ethically willing to engage in some of those questions, like how do we recruit more women, they want to know for me. And I'm like, I don't know if I want you to recruit more women. So it's sort of a tension that I sort of encounter in my work. But even before I came here, I encountered this in my work, because I think when you're studying these questions, like I was just saying, around women in peacekeeping, you have to really ask hard questions, and you have to think about what are the ethical implications and where do you draw the line, and where do you sort of say, I'm not going to engage. So that's interesting, but it is quite fascinating to think, to think about the blind spots also that are clearly here in the Swedish military, that the military isn't quite even admitting to itself. One example might be, I mentioned that I did some research on the kind of violence that women in the US military experience. So there's a huge, has been for quite a while also in the Canadian military, huge scandal about sexual violence against women in the military, which, by the way, in the US case, actually men are affected by this at even higher numbers, because of course there are more men in the military. Percentage-wise, it's more women, but overall numbers, more men experience sexual violence in the US military. And when I asked questions about this here, about the Swedish military, they just kind of looked at me and said, "You mean men also experience this?" It was like a question that nobody had asked and nobody has an answer to. So there's some understanding that women experience this within the military, but what about men? That's not even a question that anybody has asked or answered or has any data or information on. So I can't believe it's not happening, but nobody's talking about it. So it's interesting to ask these questions in the context. Dilara, on the violence against women, and I would like to add children to that, because we sometimes forget that when we have a domestic violence context, we have, of course, also oftentimes children present. So one of the things that I was referring to earlier is actually that the UN Secretary General has put this as part of, if you go to the official UN COVID-19 webpage, you will see several alerts that actually point to the fact that we should be taking this very seriously. And so I thought that was quite fascinating to see, because it's not often something that we see sort of emphasized at these highest levels of government. And the UN Women has put out a report just, I think, maybe a week or two ago, where they talk about violence, the cost of violence against women globally, and they talk about this violence as an epidemic. So they are, or actually now they're calling it a pandemic, right? So they're making the linkages also linguistically between the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of violence against women, and they're pointing out that as we have these lockdowns and as we have people losing their jobs and further insecurity in terms of economics as well, that this will likely have an effect on increased numbers of domestic violence. And we are seeing this. What I'm hearing from people all around the world is that the numbers of calls to domestic violence hotlines are going up. In Britain, there was a report, I think it was maybe last week, that the number of people who have been killed by their partners has already increased quite significantly. And then, of course, there have been, even here in Sweden, I think one of my colleagues has worked on this, that there have been calls by feminist organizations as well to make more shelter spaces available and so forth. And I still have connections to my old university in San Francisco, and I know that in California as a whole, actually, I think they made an agreement with one of the hotel chains, Motel 6, to make it available as a sort of shelter during this time, so that if people are subject to violence, they can find shelter in these hotels. And I think France and some other places have started sort of code words where you can go to a pharmacy and you can say a code word, and then they know that they need to send help to you. So I think there is a lot of different things I'm hearing from around the world, how people are both recognizing it's an issue and asking their governments to do something about it. And some governments are responding better than others, of course. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Annick. I will have to interrupt here, even though we've had a very interesting conversation, and it was very good to listen to you. I thank you very much for your time, for all the insights, ranging from the take on security and human security to the individual and movement reason, and global north versus global south when it comes to providing knowledge to the agenda on 1325 or gender, peace and security. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you live when the crisis is over.
Yes. I hope we can do that, because it would be lovely to just with all of you and meet you in person as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
We'll do that another time.
Wonderful.
Thank you for having me, and we'll talk soon.